On the 5th of July, 1841, a man called Thomas Cook put 485 passengers on a train from Leicester to Loughborough at a shilling each. It was a day trip, a temperance outing. Nobody on that platform could have known it was the beginning of something that would last 178 years. By the 1980s, Thomas Cook had branches on every high street in Britain. Nearly 22 million customers a year. Its own airline. A name so familiar it was part of the furniture. The place where ordinary families went to book their fortnight in the sun. By September 2019, it was gone. Every shop, every flight, every desk where someone had once said, "Where are you thinking of going?" The collapse required the largest peacetime repatriation in British history, just to bring the stranded customers home. Yet this is the story of what Thomas Cook was, why it worked, and why it fell apart. You'd walk in off the high street with your coat still damp from the rain. The door would swing shut behind you, and there it was. A wall of brochures, bright as stained glass. Crete, Majorca, the Algarve, Tenerife, Turkey, Florida, if you were feeling flush. Each one glossy, warm to the touch under the strip lighting, full of swimming pools and terracotta balconies, and skies that looked nothing like the one you just walked under. Somewhere behind the desks, a printer hummed. There'd be a foreign exchange board near the door, pesetas, drachma, lira, later euros, and a rack of leaflets about travel insurance. Posters on the walls promised blue seas and white sand, and at one of the desks, a woman or a man would look up from their screen and say, "Take a seat. Where are you thinking of going?" That was the Thomas Cook branch. For millions of British families, it was where summer began. Not at the airport, not on the beach. Here, in a shop on the high street, between the building society and Boots. The person behind that desk did a job that looked simple from the outside. You told them what you wanted. Somewhere hot, somewhere the kids could swim, somewhere that wasn't too far from a decent restaurant, and they made it happen. Flights, hotel, transfers, insurance, the lot. They'd print it out, put it in a wallet, and hand you your holiday. But the simplicity was the skill. What you didn't see was how much the agent had to hold in their head. Airline seat allocations, hotel contract rates, transfer schedules, which airports were easy and which were a nightmare with small children. Which resorts looked stunning in the brochure, but drew complaint after complaint once guests arrived. Which tour operators were reliable and which ones cut corners. The agent knew, or learned quickly, because their customers came back year after year, and they remembered everything. This wasn't a job built on glamour. It was built on product knowledge, patience, and trust. You'd sit across from someone who understood that for most families, this was the single biggest discretionary purchase of the year. 2 weeks in the sun. It mattered. The budget was tight, the dates were fixed around school holidays, and the whole thing had to work. The agent's job was to turn a set of hopes and constraints into a confirmed booking and to make the customer feel, as they walked back out onto the wet high street, that it was all going to be fine. Leave it with me. I'll see what I can do. The rhythm of the job followed the seasons. January was the busiest month. The Christmas bills barely cleared and already people were in, shaking off the cold, desperate for something to look forward to. The agents called it Sunshine Saturday or Wave Season, those first few weeks when half the country seemed to decide at once that they needed a holiday. The queue would stretch to the door, every desk occupied, the phones ringing without pause. You'd barely finish one booking before the next customer sat down. Brochure already open to a dog-eared page, ready to go. We tell the stories of what Britain built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. Then the pace would shift through spring and into summer. Late bookers chasing bargains, families needing last-minute changes, the odd crisis, a passport that had expired, a flight that had been rescheduled, a hotel that had been overbooked. And in the background, always, the targets. Sales targets, revenue targets, add-on targets for insurance and car hire and airport parking. The agent smiled through all of it because that was the job. Making a complicated commercial transaction feel like a friendly conversation. Learning the trade took time. You had to know the brochures inside out. Not just the headline destinations, but the small print, the supplements, the blackout dates, the child discounts that applied in some properties but not others. You had to learn the reservation systems, the codes, the fare classes. You had to develop a feel for people, the couple who knew exactly what they wanted and just needed you to book it, versus the family who needed walking through every option because they'd never flown before and were quietly terrified of getting it wrong. The best agents built a regular clientele who came back year after year, not because they couldn't book elsewhere, but because they trusted the person behind the desk to get it right. There was a particular skill, too, in managing expectation. The couple who wanted five-star luxury on a three-star budget. The family who'd set their hearts on a resort that was fully booked. The customer who'd read something worrying in the papers about a destination and needed talking round, or sometimes needed honest advice that this wasn't the year for that particular island. The good agents read people quickly. They knew when to suggest an upgrade and when to leave well alone. They knew the difference between a customer who wanted to be guided and one who just needed their own choice confirmed. And they knew, this was crucial, how to deliver bad news gently. The holiday you want doesn't exist at that price. The hotel you've chosen has had complaints. The flights on that date are gone. But here's what I can do instead. The tools changed over the decades. In the earlier years, there were printed brochures by the dozen, booking forms filled out by hand, ticket jackets, timetables, telex machines. A brochure was a serious piece of kit. Hundreds of pages, updated seasonally, full of hotel descriptions and price grids and small print. The agent had to know their way around it the way a mechanic knows an engine. Later came computer reservation systems, telephone headsets, in-store terminals linked to central booking platforms. By the 2000s, many customers walked in having already half-researched their holiday online, and the branch became the place where they came to finalize, to check, to feel the reassurance of a real person confirming what the screen had suggested. The shop itself had a particular atmosphere, quieter than most retail. People spoke in the tones they used for discussing something expensive and exciting. A pen tapping on a desk while dates were checked, the click of a keyboard, a phone call placed to a reservations line while the customer sat and watched the brochure, already imagining the poolside. Children fidgeting in the next chair, too young to care about airport transfers but old enough to know this was about a holiday. And always, somewhere, the faint smell of printed paper, ink and gloss, and the clean chemical scent of a freshly delivered stack of summer brochures. The branch wasn't only about booking flights and hotels. Thomas Cook was also one of the most familiar names in foreign exchange. You'd go in a week before departure and buy your currency over the same counter, pesetas, francs, dollars, whatever you needed, and the rate would be chalked on a board or printed on a screen behind the desk. For many families, this was the first and only time they handled foreign money before they landed. The agent would count it out, tuck it into an envelope, and remind you to keep it safe. It was another layer of the same service. The branch handled everything, so you didn't have to think about any of it until you were actually there, on the beach, with a drink in your hand. And then there was the moment, a week or two before departure, when you'd come back in to collect your travel documents. The ticket wallet, the flight details, the hotel confirmation, the transfer voucher, the luggage tags, sometimes a little booklet about your destination. It was a physical bundle, something you could hold and leaf through. The holiday, which had been abstract since January, was suddenly tangible. You could see your name printed on it. That moment of collection was part of the ritual, and it carried a small particular thrill that a confirmation email never quite replaced. And behind it all, the name above the door, Thomas Cook, a name that had been part of British life for so long that most people never thought about where it came from. They just knew it meant holidays. It meant trust. It meant the shop on the high street where you went when you wanted to go away. That trust had roots deeper than most customers ever realized. On the 5th of July, 1841, a man called Thomas Cook organized a railway excursion from Leicester to Loughborough. 485 passengers, each paying 1 shilling. It was a temperance outing. The original purpose was to get people to a rally, not to a beach. But it planted the seed of something enormous. From that single railway trip, Cook built a business around the idea that travel could be organized, packaged, and sold to ordinary people who wouldn't otherwise have known where to start. Over the following decades, the firm expanded into continental tours, American travel, eventually global operations. By 1939, Thomas Cook was advertising air holidays to Cannes at £15 and 5 shillings, roughly £930 in today's money. That was still expensive, still aspirational, but the principle was set. Thomas Cook existed to make travel manageable for people who couldn't arrange it themselves. The post-war decades changed the scale entirely. Cheap charter flights, jet engines, Mediterranean resort development, and rising wages turned the foreign holiday from a luxury into a mass expectation. Thomas Cook didn't create all of that on its own. The package holiday revolution had many architects, but the firm rode the wave and became, for many Britons, the name most closely associated with it. By the 1980s, the high street travel agent was a fixture of British life, and Thomas Cook was among the most visible of them all. What the branch actually sold was not just a flight and a hotel room. It sold a package, and the package solved a problem that's easy to forget now. Before the internet made comparison routine, someone had to bundle the flights, the beds, the airport transfers, and the local support into a single product. Someone had to negotiate with airlines and hoteliers for block allocations months in advance, committing to thousands of rooms and tens of thousands of seats before a single customer had walked through the door. Someone had to print it all up in a brochure, price it, and stand behind it when something went wrong. That was what tour operators did, and the high street agent was the shopfront where the whole system met the public. The brochure itself was a feat of logistics. Each season's edition had to be researched, photographed, written, printed, and distributed to hundreds of branches, months ahead of the travel dates it covered. The prices had to account for currency fluctuations, fuel surcharges, airport taxes, and the operator's margin, all frozen into print long before the customer picked it up. When costs shifted after publication, supplements were added as loose inserts or handwritten amendments. It was a cumbersome system, a paper-based marketplace that depended on enormous forward planning and carried real financial risk. But for decades it worked, because there was no better way to put 1,000 holiday options into a customer's hands. The economics behind the counter were specific. The operator bought capacity in bulk, aircraft seats, hotel rooms, coach transfers, and sold it on at a margin. The agent earned commission on every booking. The customer got a single price for the whole holiday, legal protection under the ATOL scheme, and someone to ring if the hotel turned out to be a building site. Britain's regulatory framework reinforced the model. ATOL protection covered more than 20 million holidaymakers a year, funded by a £2.50 levy per traveler into the Air Travel Trust Fund. The agent wasn't just selling convenience, they were selling a protected product within a national system designed to keep people safe. That protection mattered more than people realized, until they needed it. If an airline went bust or a hotel fell through, the customer wasn't left stranded or out of pocket. The system caught them, and the person who explained all of that, who made sure the booking carried the right protection, who knew the difference between an ATOL covered package and a flight-only deal, that was the agent in the shop. By 2018, the scale of Thomas Cook's operation was staggering. The group reported revenue of £9.584 billion and served nearly 22 million customers. This was not merely a chain of shops. It was a vertically integrated travel system. Tour operations, an airline with its own fleet, hotel and resort partnerships, foreign exchange services, and a retail network spread across the country. The airline alone operated flights to holiday destinations across Europe, North Africa, and beyond. The High Street branch was the visible front counter of a machine that stretched from Gatwick to the Greek islands, from Manchester to Marrakesh, and that machine depended on the person behind the desk. Not because customers couldn't read a brochure at home, many did, but because the agent turned complexity into clarity. A family didn't need to understand how airline fare buckets worked, or what an accommodation allotment was, or which ATOL certificate covered which booking. The agent handled all of it. They translated an industrial-scale travel operation into something that felt personal, local, and safe. For a long stretch of the late 20th century, that model didn't just work, it was everywhere. Thomas Cook had become what the Leicestershire Museum Archive described simply as a household name, with branches on every high street. The 1980s were the high water mark for the traditional package holiday and the travel agent who sold it. Charter flights filled with families heading for the Mediterranean. Resorts purpose built for British tourists with English menus and familiar lager on tap. And on every high street in every town of any size, a Thomas Cook or a Lun Polly or a Going Places, their windows bright with posters of places warmer than here. It wasn't just Thomas Cook, of course. The high street at peak was crowded with travel agents. Lun Polly with its fluorescent deals in the window, Going Places, Co-op Travel, At Maze, the independent agent tucked between the greengrocer and the chip shop. In some towns, you'd have 3 or 4 within a few hundred yards of each other, all selling broadly the same sun and sand packages, all competing on price and service and window displays. The sheer density told you something about how embedded the model was. There was enough business walking through British town centers to sustain all of them, for a while. You can layer the peak across 3 eras if you want to understand how deep the roots went. There was the Victorian and Edwardian Thomas Cook, the firm that made organized travel respectable and accessible, that took the middle classes to Switzerland and Egypt and the Holy Land. There was the post-war Thomas Cook, bound up with the jet age and the democratization of the foreign holiday, when a fortnight in Spain became something millions of families could aspire to. And there was the late 20th century Thomas Cook, when the annual visit to the branch was simply part of how people imagined summer. January, February, the dark months, and then the trip to Thomas Cook to book the holiday. It was as embedded in the rhythm of British life as the school calendar. The cultural reach went beyond the transaction. Thomas Cook had become a figure of speech, almost. I'll get it through Cook's meant someone else would handle the arrangements. The brand appeared in novels and sitcoms in the background of photographs of every British high street from the 1960s onward. It was so familiar it was invisible, part of the scenery like pillar boxes and bus shelters. And that, in a way, was the peak in its purest form. Not a moment of triumph, but a long plateau of ubiquity, so total that most people never questioned it. Thomas Cook was simply there, like the post office or the bank, part of the furniture. The Saturday ritual in January told you everything. Families would come in together. Mum, Dad, the kids trailing behind or running for the brochure rack. They'd sit down and the agent would ask the questions. When, where, how much, how many? An hour later, they'd walk out with a booking confirmation and a sense that the worst of winter had a fixed endpoint. That transaction, repeated millions of times across hundreds of branches year after year, was the engine of the whole business. And for the people on both sides of the desk, it was simply how things were done. And then the furniture started to shift. The important thing to understand is that Thomas Cook did not collapse because one website appeared and everyone changed habits overnight. The decline was slower and more complicated than that. Even as late as 2017, the Association of British Travel Agents found that 45% of people booking a holiday abroad still used a travel company or agent. The leading reasons were ease, confidence, and time saved. People hadn't suddenly stopped wanting help. What changed was the economics underneath. Low-cost airlines were part of it. When Ryanair and EasyJet began offering cheap point-to-point flights in the 1990s and early 2000s, they broke open a market that had been structured around charter operations and package deals. Suddenly, you could fly to Malaga for 30 quid if you booked early enough. You didn't need Thomas Cook to get you there. Booking websites were the other half. Expedia, Booking.com, LastMinute.com. They let customers assemble their own holidays, compare prices, read reviews from other travelers, and skip the high street entirely. The brochure, once the essential tool of discovery, was now competing with the search engine, and the search engine had advantages the brochure never could. It was available at midnight. It didn't close for lunch. It showed you photographs uploaded by real guests, not polished shots chosen by the tour operator. It let you read, in brutal detail, what the family from Doncaster thought about the plumbing in room 214. That transparency changed expectations. Customers who walked into Thomas Cook in 2015 often knew more about their chosen hotel than the agent behind the desk. The balance of expertise had shifted, quietly but unmistakably, from the person selling the holiday to the person buying it. The decline didn't happen all at once. For years, the old model and the new one ran side by side. Families who'd always used an agent kept using one. Younger travelers, comfortable with screens and comparison sites, never started. The customer base aged gradually, and the footfall thinned. The agents noticed quieter mornings, fewer walk ins, more inquiries that ended with, "I'll have a think," and never came back. Because the thinking happened at home, on a laptop, and the booking happened there too. By 2007, industry consolidation had already reshaped the landscape. Thomas Cook merged with My Travel that year, shrinking the old Big Four operators down to the Big Two. The merger was supposed to create scale and efficiency. What it also created was debt. Thomas Cook's debt problems would later be described as the consequence of ill-timed deals made about a decade earlier. The company carried a debt pile of around $2.1 billion dollars, and by some estimates needed to sell 3 million holidays a year just to cover its interest payments. That is a brutal position for any business, but especially for one operating on thin margins in a market that was fragmenting beneath it. Every seat unsold, every room uncommitted, every brochure printed for a holiday nobody booked. It all fed the gap between what the company owed and what it earned. The company tried to adapt. Its 2018 annual results showed online sales growing by nearly 30%. It closed 100 loss-making retail stores and pushed into what the industry calls dynamic packaging, letting customers build tailored holidays online rather than choosing from a fixed brochure menu. But the high street estate was still enormous. The airlines still had to be fueled and crewed, the hotel commitments still had to be honored, and the debt still had to be serviced. Thomas Cook was halfway through becoming something else, while still paying for everything it used to be. You could see the awkwardness of that transition in the branches themselves. Shops that had once been pure retail, brochures, desks, face-to-face selling, were now trying to be hybrid spaces. Screens on the walls showing destination videos, tablets for customers to browse alongside the agent, the brochure racks thinning out as print runs shrank. Staff trained on digital tools but still sitting behind the same desks, still serving the same walk-in customers who came precisely because they didn't want to do it online. It was two business models, so sharing one shopfront, and neither quite worked as well as it needed to. External shocks made a weak structure weaker. A failed coup in Turkey in 2016 damaged demand for one of the company's most important destination markets. The 2018 British heat wave, a glorious summer at home, crushed late booking demand, particularly in the UK market. Thomas Cook's own results blame the heat wave directly for sharply weaker summer trading. When the sun shines in Britain, fewer people feel the urgency to book a last-minute escape abroad. For a company already stretched thin, that lost revenue was devastating. In March 2019, Thomas Cook announced the closure of 21 more high street shops with 320 job losses. The company said that 64% of UK bookings were now made online. And the retail estate was down to 566 shops. A £900 million recapitalization plan was assembled. For a moment, it looked as though the company might survive. Restructured, smaller, digitally focused, but alive. Then lenders demanded a further £200 million that couldn't be found. The last rescue attempt collapsed over a weekend, and then it was over. On the 23rd of September 2019, winding up orders were made against Thomas Cook Group plc and its associated companies. The official receiver was appointed liquidator. Bookings were canceled. Retail shops closed immediately. 26 companies ceased trading, including Thomas Cook Airlines. Around 9,000 people in the United Kingdom were made redundant. The speed was the cruelest part. A company that had traded for 178 years was gone in a single night. The shops that had spent decades representing certainty and reassurance became, overnight, places that could offer neither. Shutters down, lights off. The brochures still on the racks inside, advertising holidays that would never be taken. Window displays still showing sun-drenched beaches, while the reality behind the glass was empty desks and disconnected phones. For the staff, the end came without ceremony. Many learned from news reports that their jobs no longer existed. People who had spent years, decades, some of them, learning the trade, building relationships with regular customers, earning modest livings from a job they were good at, found themselves redundant before the shops had even been cleared out. 9,000 people. Not statistics. Individuals with mortgages and school runs and the particular hard-won expertise of knowing how to make a stranger's holiday work. The woman who'd been in the same branch for 15 years, who knew her regulars by name, who'd booked their weddings abroad and their anniversary trips and their first holidays with grandchildren, she locked the door for the last time, and that was that. But the collapse didn't only affect the people who worked there. Roughly 150,000 Thomas Cook customers were abroad when the company failed. They were on beaches and in hotel lobbies and at airport check-in desks, and their return flights had just ceased to exist. Some arrived at airports to find Thomas Cook desks unmanned and departure boards blank where their flights should have been. All hotels began demanding fresh payment from guests whose stays had already been paid for, or so they'd thought, through the now defunct tour operator. The Civil Aviation Authority launched what became one of the largest peacetime repatriation operations in British history. Between the 23rd of September and the 7th of October, they organized 746 flights from 54 airports in 18 countries, bringing home more than 140,000 people at an estimated direct cost to the Department for Transport of £83 million. Think about that contrast for a moment. A familiar shopfront failure, the kind of thing high streets had seen before with Woolworths, with BHS, became a state-managed airlift on a national scale. That is how deeply Thomas Cook was woven into the fabric of British travel. The company's reach was so vast that when it fell, the government had to step in and fly people home. After the collapse came Salvage. Hayes Travel, a Sunderland-based independent agency, acquired the entire UK retail estate of 555 stores and initially took on 421 former Thomas Cook staff. It was a lifeline for some, a chance to stay in the trade they knew, behind a different counter, under a different name, though the pandemic that followed barely a year later would test the whole travel industry again in ways nobody could have predicted. Meanwhile, the Thomas Cook Archive, brochures, posters, passenger lists, guidebooks, and the paper trail of nearly 2 centuries of organized travel, was transferred to the Record Office for Leicestershire, Leicester, and Rutland. A living commercial system became historical material, preserved for the nation and the county where it all began. The brochures that had once been tools of the trade were now museum pieces, handled with gloves instead of thumbed through over a cup of tea. So what was lost and what was gained? What was lost was not only a company, but a form of mediation. The Thomas Cook branch, and the hundreds of other high street travel agents like it, stood between a complicated global industry and the ordinary family who just wanted a fortnight in the sun. It translated complexity into confidence. It turned the bewildering business of flights and hotels and transfers and insurance into something manageable, something you could hold in your hand in a printed wallet with your name on it. For older customers especially, and for anyone who found the internet overwhelming or untrustworthy, the branch was irreplaceable. A real person in a real shop who would look you in the eye and say it was all sorted. What disappeared with the old branch network was also a particular kind of local expertise. The agent who knew which resort suited young families, the one who'd steer you away from the hotel that photographed well but had thin walls and a building site next door, the one who remembered that you'd been to Rhodes last year and asked if you fancied trying Kefalonia this time. That knowledge lived in people, not in algorithms, and when the shops closed, it scattered. You can't archive experience the way you archive a brochure. Something else was lost too, though it's harder to name. The branch was a place where anticipation was given shape. You walked in with a vague longing for sun, and you walked out with dates, a destination, a confirmed booking. The holiday became real in that moment, not when you packed your suitcase or boarded the plane, but when someone printed the itinerary and slid it across the desk. That small ritual of transformation, from daydream to plan, happened millions of times in Thomas Cook branches across the country. It was ordinary and it was quietly significant, and there is no online equivalent that feels quite the same. But what was gained was real, too. Customers could compare prices in seconds. They could read thousands of reviews from other travelers. They could build exactly the holiday they wanted. Fly into one city, out of another, stay in an apartment rather than a hotel, skip the transfers entirely and hire a car. The friction of branch opening hours, of waiting for a callback, of being limited to whichever operators the agency stocked, all of that fell away. Thomas Cook's own data told the story plainly. By the end, nearly two-thirds of its UK bookings were made online. The market didn't reject holidays, it rejected some of the old machinery for selling them. The larger pattern is one Britain has seen many times. A trusted local intermediary, the bank manager, the insurance broker, the record shop owner, the travel agent, holds on longer than the commentators expect, then disappears quickly once technology, economics, and consumer habit line up against it. The transition is never as clean as it looks in retrospect. There's always a period where the old and new coexist, where the branch tries to become a showroom for online bookings, where the business carries the costs of both worlds and the margins get thinner and thinner until something snaps. But this story isn't total extinction. The most recent reporting from ABTA shows that 34% of respondents still used a travel professional in the previous 12 months, and 61% of holidays abroad were still booked as packages. The occupation didn't vanish. It shrank, consolidated, and migrated to phone lines, to specialist agencies, to the kind of complex or high-value trip where a human expert still earns their keep. The old Thomas Cook High Street world went. The need for help, protection, and bundled travel did not. And perhaps that's what makes this story worth telling. It wasn't merely the death of a brand or the closure of a chain of shops. It was the breaking of a long chain that linked a railway excursion from Leicester to Loughborough in 1841 to the post-war package holiday boom to the brochure racks and booking desks of every British high street. 178 years of organized travel ended in a single night, and then 140,000 people brought home by government-chartered planes because the system that was supposed to look after them had ceased to exist. The first Thomas Cook excursion carried 485 passengers, 12 miles by train, at a shilling each. The collapse required 746 flights from 54 airports in 18 countries. That arc tells you something about how travel expanded, democratized, globalized, and finally outgrew one of the very companies that had taught the country how to do it. There's a desk in a branch that isn't there anymore in a town you probably know. A brochure open flat under the strip light. A family leaning in, choosing between Mallorca and Tenerife. A member of staff with a pen in hand and a screen full of options, saying the thing they always said, "Leave it with me. I'll see what I can do." The branch is gone now. The name was bought and relaunched as an online-only brand. Thomas Cook, without the shops, without the desks, without the person across the counter. The brochures are in an archive in Leicestershire, handled with cotton gloves by researchers instead of thumbed through by families choosing their summer. But the holiday, the idea that ordinary people deserve a fortnight somewhere warm, with everything taken care of, that started on a platform in Leicester, and it hasn't gone anywhere. Did your family book through Thomas Cook? Do you remember the branch in your town, the posters in the window, the brochure you took home and pored over at the kitchen table? Do you remember the moment you collected your tickets, held the wallet in your hands, and felt the holiday become real? And if you ever worked behind one of those desks, what part of the job do people who never did it fail to understand?